Before the mountains existed to hide them, they were something else.
This is where every account of the Balrogs must begin. Not in the deep places of the earth where they eventually made their dwelling, not in the fires of Angband where they served, but earlier, in the formless interval between the great music and the shaping of the world, when the Ainur was still deciding what they would be within the thing they had sung into existence. They were Maiar then, spirits of the second order, not as vast in power as the Valar above them, but not small either. They were potent, purposeful, formed of the same fundamental substance as all the other holy ones who had sung the world into being, and who now descended into it to give it shape.
They had been fire, not the ravenous, destroying fire that they would later become, not the fire of things consumed and gone, but something closer to what fire is at its essential core, the brightness of it, the warmth, the illumination, the way fire has always been the thing that holds darkness back. Fire in the sense of energy, of life expressed as light and heat, of the foundational force that moves through all created matter and keeps it from stillness. They carried this as other Maiar carried other gifts, as naturally as water carries current, as rock carries density, as nothing special, simply what they were. And then Melkor spoke to them.
The seduction of the Balrogs is not recorded in full in any surviving account. The moment is present in the histories only as its outcome, the fact of them, dark and terrible, standing in Angband at their master's command, in a world they had helped shape and chosen to corrupt. What Melkor offered them is nowhere precisely specified, and perhaps this is fitting, because the law that bends a powerful spirit from its nature towards another service is never quite the same for any two minds, and the records of what each of them was told and what each of them chose to believe about the telling are not preserved.
What is preserved is this: they were many at first, in the ages before the elves awoke, when Melkor's power was less constrained and the corrupting of spirits was ongoing rather than increasingly difficult. Numbers of the Maiar gave themselves over to his service and took the forms that his service demanded. The Balrogs were those who gave themselves most completely to the fire and the shadow, who took the destructive, consuming aspect of fire as their permanent nature, and wrapped the darkness of their master's design around it as a second skin. They were not the subtlest of Morgoth's servants. That title belonged to Sauron, whose intelligence ran toward manipulation, and whose gifts were toward the long, indirect corruption. The Balrogs were a different kind of terrible. They were direct. They were the end of a sentence that began with everything else that Morgoth did. The armies, the planning, the long, patient accumulation of advantage, and they were what that sentence meant when it was finally spoken aloud.
Their number diminished over the long ages. The making of Balrogs, the corruption of a Maiar into that specific form of darkness, was not a thing that could be done infinitely. The Maiar were finite in number, and those who did not take the path towards Morgoth held their ground against it with increasing firmness as the elder days continued and his intentions became impossible to misread. By the time of the Great Wars in Beleriand, the records suggest the Balrogs numbered at most 7, perhaps fewer. Each one was a horror sufficient to turn the tide of a battle by its presence alone, and 7 of them, moving through the armies of Angband like fire moving through a city, was more than enough
to make the difference in every engagement that counted.
Now look at one of them. Look carefully, because the looking matters, and because the descriptions that survive from those who were close enough to see clearly, and somehow survived the seeing, are precise enough to constitute a full account.
They were enormous. The word does not quite cover what is meant by it in this context. Not enormous the way a very large man is enormous, measured against an ordinary man and found significantly larger. They were enormous the way a collapsing building is enormous, the way a wave is enormous when it rises above the height of the ship it is about to take. Their forms were broadly man-shaped, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, which made the scale of them stranger rather than less, because the human template at the wrong side produces a wrongness that a completely alien form would not. You expected the proportions to be familiar. They were not.
Everything was too large, and within the largeness, too solid, as though density had accumulated inside their frames beyond what the materials of ordinary matter could account for.
The fire was in them, not on them. This distinction is what makes the accounts difficult to pass if you are imagining an ordinary fire lit outside an ordinary body. The flame did not sit on the surface of a Balrog the way fire sits on a burning piece of wood, consuming from the outside inward. It came from within, moved through the body from some internal source that had no mechanical explanation, surfacing through the skin, the eyes, the mouth, the cracks between forms that should have been sealed.
The surface of a Balrog in its full expression was not uniform. There were places where the fire was dense and almost white-hot, and places where it had pulled back into something dimmer, more orange, and where through the relative dimness, the dark underneath could be seen. Not skin, not armor, but shadow in the shape of a body, as if the Balrog's physical form was assembled from 2 materials in constant tension with each other, the fire and the dark, neither quite winning.
The shadow was not incidental. Some of the accounts from those who faced Balrogs and afterward attempted to describe them recorded this as the most disorienting aspect, the darkness that surrounded and interpenetrated the fire rather than being displaced by it. Most fires push back darkness. That is fire's primary function, the thing that has made it precious to every creature that has ever lived in a world that has nights. The darkness around a Balrog did not recede from the fire. It was drawn into it, tangled up with it, inseparable from it, as if the fire and the shadow had been woven together so long and so completely that they had stopped being 2 separate properties and become a single substance with 2 apparent faces.
Their eyes carried the fire without the shadow, in a face that otherwise flickered between illumination and darkness. The eyes were consistently bright, the red of deep coals, the orange of iron in the forge at the precise moment between solid and liquid, a light that moved and shifted, but did not waver in the way that faces in firelight waver, because this light came from inside rather than from an external source.
To meet those eyes across the distance of a battlefield was to receive something beyond what sight ordinarily delivers, a heat that was not temperature, a weight that was not physical force, a message from the thing behind them that was not words, but was legible nonetheless, ancient and purposeful, and entirely without the quality,
that separates a predator from a destroyer. A predator wants something specific. The Balrogs' gaze, in the accounts of those who survived it long enough to record what they saw, wanted only the end of the thing it was looking at. Their voices, when they used them, were thunder preceded by no lightning, sound at the frequency that precedes structural failure in stone, in bone, in whatever organization of self a living mind uses to hold its fear in place. They did not speak often. Speech requires an interlocutor you consider worth addressing, and the Balrogs in the histories do not appear to have considered their opponents worth the additional effort. They arrived and they destroyed, and the sounds they made were the sounds of that arriving and that destroying, and these were sufficient to communicate everything they needed to communicate.
Their weapons, a whip of fire, many-thonged, that moved through the air with a sound like tearing, and a blade that was sometimes described as a sword and sometimes as a cleaver of darkness, enormous in scale, sometimes burning along its length, and sometimes simply dark. The whip had reach, and the Balrogs used it with the ease of something that had carried this weapon for so long it was no longer a held object, but an extension of the arm, a natural feature of the form, as natural as talons to a hawk. The crack of a Balrog's whip against air was a sound that lived in the memories of those who heard it, and did not diminish with time the way most sounds do. They heard it again in the quiet moments, in the dark.
Their feet cracked stone when they moved with purpose, not the incidental cracking of heavy weight on old rock, but something more fundamental, as if the ground beneath them was responding to the quality of what stood on it, rather than merely the quantity. Fire moves through stone, given enough of it and enough time. The Balrogs had enough of both. The greatest of them was Gothmog.
He was the Lord of Balrogs, the highest ranking of Morgoth's servants after Sauron himself, the High Captain of Angband, the one who commanded when command was necessary, and who fought at the front when fighting was needed, and who served as the physical expression of Morgoth's will in the field, the way a general is the physical expression of a strategy that exists otherwise only as intention. He was the most powerful of an already overwhelming category. What made Gothmog's presence on a battlefield different from the presence of the other Balrogs was a matter of degree rather than kind, and degree at the level of the Balrogs is a significant quantity. His history is written in the deaths of elven lords.
Fëanor died burning on the plain before Angband in the first years of the First Age, after coming too far ahead of his own forces in the fury of his first assault on Morgoth's territory. The Balrogs surrounded him, 3 or more of them, emerging from the dark with fire and whip, catching the greatest craftsman who ever lived in the open and cutting him off from any assistance. He was, even then, extraordinary. He fought them with a sword and with the force of a spirit so incandescent that even surrounded and outmatched, he made them give ground again and again before they closed in.
The wounds they gave him were mortal. Though he did not die on the plain, his sons retrieved him and bore him a short distance away before his body could no longer contain what was in it, and his spirit departed in a last conflagration. Gothmog was there for this. Whether the final blow was his, the accounts do not specify with certainty.
What they specify is that the Lord of Balrogs was present when the greatest of the elves died, and that after the death, the Balrogs withdrew, and that what they had done in those few hours in the dark before Angband altered the course of the wars that followed, because Fëanor, alive and directing, was not something Morgoth's fortress could have withstood indefinitely.
Fingon, the High King, fell at the Nearnaith Arnoediad. The Battle of Unnumbered Tears was the greatest military catastrophe the free peoples of Beleriand ever suffered. The largest force they ever assembled against Morgoth, destroyed in a single day through a combination of treachery and the simple, overwhelming weight of what Morgoth sent against them. Fingon held the western front with everything he had, and when the eastern force collapsed under the treachery of the Easterlings, and the whole shape of the battle changed in an instant from a possible victory to an irreversible rout, he held his position and fought the rear guard with the knowledge that the retreat behind him would not survive if he did not hold.
Gothmog came for him personally. A Balrog, one of the others, unnamed in the records, struck Fingon first, wounding him. In that moment, with the wound taken and the shield broken, and the battle around him the ruins of what it had been an hour before, Gothmog arrived. They fought. What can be said about a duel between the Lord of Balrogs and the High King of the Noldor is constrained by the nature of the combatants. Fingon was among the greatest elf lords in arms of the entire First Age, a warrior of tremendous skill and enormous courage, fighting in the full knowledge of what the loss of his position would mean for the people retreating behind him. He was not simply struck down, he fought.
But Gothmog was Gothmog, and in the end Fingon fell. And where the High King of the Noldor fell, the ground was black, and the fire that had been in Gothmog burned in the air above it for a long time after.
Húrin was taken alive that same day, not by Gothmog, by others, after the defense he kept beyond any reason or any calculation of personal survival. But the capture was Morgoth's order, and Gothmog's forces carried it out, and Húrin went to Angband in chains, with the memory of what he had seen done to the people around him on that field, a memory that would not be the worst thing he was forced to carry. Then there was Gondolin.
The assault on the hidden city in the year 510 of the First Age was the most carefully planned and most absolutely destructive military action Morgoth ever executed. He had been searching for Gondolin for generations, the hidden valley, the concealed city, the last great stronghold of the Noldor that his armies had never found, because its concealment was perfect enough that even his servants, who moved through the dark places of the world, had not been able to locate it. A traitor from inside the city told him. He spent years after that learning what he needed to know and assembling what he needed to assemble. And when he finally moved, he moved with everything.
The Balrogs came through the mountain passes in the night. They came with dragons, with orcs in numbers sufficient to darken the approaches to the valley, with fire lit on every ridge, and the sky above the mountains red with reflected heat, before anyone inside Gondolin saw the first enemy. The assault was designed to give Gondolin no time to prepare,
no time to send for help, no time to do anything but fight and fall, and it was designed correctly. The city was taken before dawn.
In the fighting inside the city, the Balrogs moved through the streets the way fire moves through a building, finding every path, filling every space, touching everything, and leaving nothing intact. The houses of Gondolin, built in the elvish tradition of stone carved to fit into its own landscape, offered no more protection from them than paper offers from ordinary fire. Less, because stone at high enough temperature becomes plastic, becomes deformable, stops being the shelter it was built to be.
Ecthelion of the Fountain stood in the square before the king's fountain and held it against a Balrog, held it alone with his sword, in the specific way that the defenders of Gondolin held positions that night, not because holding was possible for long, but because behind every position was something worth the time it cost to hold. Ecthelion and the Balrog he faced fell together into the basin of the fountain. The water quenched the fire. They drowned together, or were destroyed together in some combination of drowning and the cessation of whatever sustained the Balrog's form in the absence of its fire.
This is a recurring fact in the accounts of the Balrogs, and it deserves to be held as a fact rather than skipped past. Water was antithetical to them, not in a mystical or symbolic sense only, but in a direct and consequential sense. The fire that was central to their nature, that was not merely on them, but constitutively of them, was subject to what fire has always been subject to, its opposite. Water did not merely inconvenience them, it reached into their essential structure and removed the thing that held the structure together. Glorfindel killed a Balrog on a cliff in the mountain pass during the escape from Gondolin.
He was the lord of the House of the Golden Flower, one of Gondolin's 12 great houses, each distinguished by their lord and their colour and their character. He was a Noldorin elf of extraordinary courage and skill in arms, tall and bright and fierce in the specific way that people are fierce when they have attached their fierceness to a purpose they consider worth ending it on. During the long, desperate night of the city's fall, he led his people and others through the streets and out through the secret way that Idril had prepared against exactly this eventuality. And when they reached the mountain passes and thought perhaps the worst was behind them, a Balrog found them on the cliff path.
What followed was between Glorfindel and the Balrog, on the edge of the cliff above the valley below, in the cold air and the firelight, with the people he had been guiding, watching from where they had been able to take cover. The accounts say he held the creature long enough for the others to pass, held it with his sword, and with whatever was in him that made him the kind of person who volunteers for the position between the darkness and the people behind him. He killed it. He drove his blade into it, and the Balrog fell from the cliff. He fell with it, pulled over the edge, and the eagle Thorondor came and retrieved his body from where it had come to rest below.
He was sent back. The Valar, or the will of the One expressed through the Valar, returned Glorfindel to the world, renewed, in the later age. He walked in Middle-earth again in the Third Age, as the same person who had died on that cliff, carrying the memory of what it cost to hold a Balrog on the edge of nothing, while the people behind you found their way through. This is confirmed by the accounts. Glorfindel, who greeted the Fellowship near Rivendell, and who had prophesied the Witch King's end, and who carried a light that the Nazgul would not approach. This was the same Glorfindel who died in the mountains above Gondolin, returned. The sacrifice had not been wasted. Death, for those who die for reasons as clear as his, is sometimes not final.
The War of Wrath ended the First Age, and in its ending, it ended most of the Balrogs. The host of the Valar came with a power that the armies of Beleriand had never been able to marshal. The full force of the Western powers, spirits of immense authority, moving in the physical world with the specific purpose of breaking something that had been building for centuries, and breaking it completely. The Balrogs who came out to fight this host found themselves facing beings of comparable nature but uncompromised essence, Maiar and Valar, who had not given themselves over to shadow, who had not traded whatever they were originally for a master's service. The fire of a Balrog meeting this did not simply fail, it was outweighed. It was the difference between a great fire and the sun.
Most of them were destroyed. The details of each destruction are not preserved in full. The War of Wrath was so vast and so absolutely decisive that individual combats within it were largely lost to the records. What is preserved is the outcome. When the war ended and Angband was broken, and Morgoth was taken, and the First Age was over, the Balrogs were gone from the world. All but a very few. The few who survived did so by running, by hiding, by the specific choice of a powerful being that has decided, in the face of something it cannot overcome, that survival matters more than the continuation of the fight. They shed their great forms, reduced themselves to something small, something shadow-like, less than a wraith, but not precisely nothing, and they found the deepest places available to them and went into the dark and stayed there. One of them went into the roots of the mountains called the Misty Mountains, which rose like a spine down the middle of Middle-earth from north to south, ancient and vast, and full of the internal complexity of rock that has been under pressure for geological ages. It went down through the upper tunnels, and through the middle depths, and through the lower galleries, and kept going, past the level where light had ever reached, past the level where the air moved in any detectable way, into the places where the stone itself was warm from the heat of the world below it, where the darkness was so absolute that it had weight and texture and the quality of something almost alive.
It found the deeps beneath the mountain the dwarves would eventually call Khazad-dûm. And it stopped.
It stopped, and it stayed. And the ages of the world moved above it the way weather moves above a deep cave, sensed, but not directly experienced. A distant change in pressure, a shift in the quality of the stone's resonance, nothing that required response or reaction. The Second Age came and went. The kingdoms of men were built and fell. The One Ring was forged and lost. The great wars of the free peoples against Sauron were fought and partially won, and the Third Age began. The Balrog did not stir.
It rested in the dark beneath the mountain, banked like a fire that has been covered to preserve its coals through a long night, waiting for nothing and expecting nothing, present and dormant in the way of things that do not require the world's engagement in order to continue.
Khazad-dûm grew above it.
The dwarves of Durin's line had begun delving into the Misty Mountains in the First Age, and over the long centuries of the Third Age, they had built there the greatest dwarvish city that had ever existed, a realm of vast halls and arched bridges and carved galleries extending through the mountain in every direction, lit by the light that somehow filtered through crafted shafts and channeled water and the dwarves' own skill with stone. They called it Khazad-dûm, the mansions of Durin, and in the height of their prosperity, it was not merely a mine, but a civilization, with tens of thousands of dwarves living and working in its depths, its upper halls containing markets and forges and the courts of kings.
What they were mining above all other things was mithril, the true silver, the metal of extraordinary lightness and hardness that existed in significant quantities nowhere else in the world, whose properties were such that armor made of it was worth more than the value of an entire kingdom, and whose veins ran through Khazad-dûm into the roots of the mountain Zirakzigil and drew the dwarves downward, always downward, because the veins went down, and where the veins went, the dwarves followed.
They dug towards the sleeping fire, and they did not know it was there. The Balrog in the deep had not moved in 3,000 years. The dwarves did not know about it, because there was nothing to know about in any detectable sense. No heat differential, no sound, no disturbance in the stone, no signal of any kind that a civilization built in the levels above it could have received and interpreted as a warning. They dug because the mithril was there, and because dwarves dig, and because the specific combination of these two facts has been sufficient throughout the history of the world to explain a very large number of the worst things that have ever happened to them. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, they went too deep.
The account does not specify exactly how the first contact happened, whether the digging broke through into a chamber where the Balrog rested, or whether the vibrations of long and sustained delving reached into the deep, and the deep answered, or whether some other mechanism was involved. What the account specifies is the outcome. The Balrog woke. Try to understand what waking means for something that has been banked for 3,000 years.
The fire that had been held at its lowest possible level, consuming almost nothing, maintaining only the minimum required for continuity. This fire came back. Not slowly, not as a gradual warming, but as the way a fire comes back when the damper is opened and the air reaches the coals. Suddenly, with the specific violence of something released from constraint, going from dormant to present in a matter that felt to anything within the relevant radius like an eruption. The dark that had surrounded and cushioned and concealed it was displaced. The stone around it registered the change in temperature.
The dwarves above it, in the levels they thought were deep, felt whatever the stone sense of a people who have spent their entire civilization in contact with rock permits them to feel when something below them returns to full expression. They ran, those who could. Those who were close enough to what happened to be in the path of it first did not run. They were simply gone, in the manner of things that encounter fire before they have time to register what is about to happen to them. King Durin VI died, the sixth king of Khazad-dûm to bear the name of the founder of Durin's line, a name given because the resemblance to Durin the Deathless himself was so striking that the dwarves believed across the generations that Durin had been born again.
This Durin, in the year 1980, encountered what had woken in the deep, and the encounter ended as encounters with a Balrog end for those who are not something of equivalent or greater power. He died in the darkness he had been digging deeper into for years, and what killed him wore the darkness like a garment and carried fire like a weapon.
9 Eye, his son, lasted 1 year. He took the kingship and tried to hold Khazad-dûm, and failed in the way that all things failed when they tried to hold ground against what had come up from the roots. In 1981, he died too. After that, the dwarves abandoned Moria, the name it now carried, Moria, the Black Pit, the name given in dread to replace the name given in pride, and they scattered into the world, and Khazad-dûm stood empty of everything that had made it alive, occupied only by the thing that had driven it empty, and by the dark. The dwarves called it Durin's Bane.
Not a name, a description, a designator. The way you label a thing that you cannot afford to name, because naming requires a relationship between the namer and the named that you do not wish to have with this. Durin's Bane, the thing that killed Durin, the ending of an era given a label rather than an identity, because the identity was something they did not look at directly. For 1,000 years, it held Moria alone.
The orcs came eventually. Moria was deep and defensible and dark, and orcs move towards deep, defensible, dark places the way water moves towards the lowest available point. They came in cautiously, and they found the Balrog, or the Balrog found them, and whatever passed between them in those first encounters left the orcs as servants, and Moria as the Balrog's domain. They did its work. They held the upper halls and the outer gates, and the long, dark passages of the mountain, and in exchange they were permitted to continue, which in the context of Moria was a significant thing to be permitted.
In the year 2989 of the Third Age, a dwarf named Balin led a colony back into Moria. He was old by dwarf reckoning, which is substantial, and he had spent his life in the service of Durin's legacy and in the hope of reclaiming what had been lost, and the hope had not diminished with age, but had become the kind of hope that only the very determined carry past the point where it should rationally have failed. He went in with a company of dwarves willing to follow him, and they reclaimed sections of the upper halls, and they held them for 5 years.
The records they left behind, carved into rock and written on pages and sealed into a book of Mazarbul, describe those 5 years in the compressed, careful language of people who know they may not have many words left. The early years, good, progress, the halls reclaimed, something like hope, justified. Then the orcs pressing harder, then something worse than orcs coming from the lower levels in ways that the dwarves had not prepared for and could not adequately defend against. Then the last entries, short, increasingly urgent, and then the last of them. They are coming. We cannot get out. The end comes.
Balin died first, outside, an arrow, not the Balrog's work. The others lasted until the orcs and whatever drove them broke through in force. The colony of Moria ended 5 years after it began, and the Book of Mazarbul sat in the chamber of Mazarbul with the dead around it until the Fellowship of the Ring came through. In the year 3019 of the Third Age, 9 people entered Moria.
Frodo Baggins,
a hobbit carrying the One Ring, the most consequential object in the history of the world. His companions, Samwise Gamgee, Meriadoc Brandybuck, Peregrine Took, Gandalf the Grey, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Boromir. They entered through the west gate when the other routes through the mountains were closed to them, and they moved through the dark in the specific manner of those who know they are somewhere they should not be, and are committed to the passage regardless. Gandalf led them, navigating by memory and by the qualities of air and rock that a wizard of his nature can read in ways the others could not.
In the chamber of Mazarbul, they found Balin's tomb and the record of what had happened to his colony, and the orcs that the record had attracted, and then the cave troll that the orcs brought with them through the door. And the fighting in that chamber was the first indication to those who had not known it that something was hunting them through the mountain, that the sounds echoing up through the rock were not random, were directional, were moving towards them with purpose.
They ran through the second hall, through the passages beyond, down through the levels toward the eastern gate and the bridge of Khazad-dûm that spanned the great chasm of Moria and led toward the other side and the exit. They moved as fast as the passage allowed, and behind them, the sounds that were not random moved faster.
The bridge of Khazad-dûm was a narrow arch of stone crossing a chasm that dropped into darkness so absolute that throwing a stone into it produced only the sound of the throw and never the sound of landing. The bridge had no railing. It was wide enough for one person at a time, perhaps two if they were careful, and it crossed the chasm at the point where the gap was narrowest, without being crossable any other way. Beyond it, the eastern gate. Beyond the eastern gate, the slopes of the mountain and the open air of the outside world, and whatever chance of survival the outside world provided. 7 of the 9 had crossed it. 2 remained on the near side, Gandalf, who had been last, and Frodo, who had lingered. The Balrog came.
It came through the dark of the hall, above the bridge's nearer end, not from one direction, but from the general direction of back, of behind, of the way they had come, filling that direction with itself, the way darkness fills a room when the light is removed. Its shadow reached the bridge before its body did, which was itself a statement about the scale of what was coming, that a shadow could precede it by enough distance to be registered separately, to be identified as the forerunner of something, rather than simply as the natural darkness of the place. Then the fire.
The fire was what gave it form, was what revealed that the shadow had a center, had a body, had a shape that was man-like in outline and wrong in all the specifics of that outline. The flame burned around its form and through it, and the shadow around the flame did not retreat from it in the way that ordinary shadow retreats from ordinary fire. It pressed in alongside it instead, a companion to the brightness rather than its absence, and in the space between the two substances, the fire and the dark, the Balrog moved.
It was larger than the space around it seemed able to contain. Its arms spread wide in the approach, not threatening, not quite yet, simply occupying the full width of itself, which was the full width of the passage. Its feet cracked the stone of the floor as it moved. The air ahead of it carried the heat of it,
before the light of it reached those watching at the bridge's far end. Legolas, who was an elf, and who carried in his nature the long memory of what elves knew and feared, raised his bow and stood frozen, the arrow ready, the bowstring drawn, the aim true, and did not shoot. There are things that arrows do not help with. He knew what he was looking at.
It carried a whip in one hand. The whip's thongs were fire, each one a separate lash of flame that moved in the air around it with the coiling, autonomous motion of things alive. In the other hand, it carried a blade, dark, enormous, proportionate to its wielder in the way that increases rather than mitigates the sense of wrong scale. Its eyes in the face above the fire and the shadow were two red points of light that did not move in the way that firelight moves, that held their position with the stillness of intention rather than dancing with the randomness of flame. The Balrog stepped onto the bridge. The stone cracked. Gandalf walked to the bridge's center and turned around and faced it.
What Gandalf was on that bridge was not what he appeared to be. He appeared to be an old man in grey, tall for a man, staff in one hand, sword in the other, standing alone on a narrow arch of stone over a chasm with no bottom. What he was, underneath that appearance, was a Maiar, a spirit of the same fundamental order as the thing coming toward him, the same essential category of being, formed in the same moment of creation, and carrying the same fundamental substance.
But where the Balrog had given itself over to Morgoth and spent the long ages in service to destruction, Gandalf had been sent to Middle-earth specifically to contest that destruction, sent by the Valar, clothed in old flesh and old age and the appearance of limitation, carrying within that disguise the fire of the Ainur undiminished.
He spoke to the Balrog. He said, "You cannot pass." He said, "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor." He said, "The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun." He said, "You shall not pass." These were not words in the ordinary sense. They were a statement of nature against nature. The fire of Anor, the sun's fire, the fire of the world's light, set against the fire of Udun, the fire of the ancient pits of Morgoth, the fire of everything that opposed the light, since before the mountains existed. Two Maiar on a bridge over a bottomless drop, one of them carrying the fire of the deep, and the other carrying the fire of the sky, speaking the words that named what each of them was and what each of them served.
The Balrog did not answer in words. It stepped onto the bridge and raised its whip, and the thongs of fire cracked in the air above it. Gandalf struck the bridge. The staff came down on the stone, and what was in the staff, the power within it, the Maiar within the old man, the flame of Anor that does not come from any fire that can be lit or quenched, released into the bridge at the point of contact, and the bridge broke. The stone gave way in a single clean fracture directly beneath the Balrog's feet, and what had been solid became air, and the Balrog fell. The whip caught Gandalf.
The thongs of fire, alive in their own fashion, caught him around the legs as the Balrog fell, and the fall pulled him forward, and he struck the edge of the broken bridge with his hands, holding for one moment, his staff gone, his sword gone, looking up at the 8 people on the far side of the broken bridge, looking at Frodo, whose face was the last face he saw. And then he let go, or was pulled, or the stone under his hands gave way to. He fell into the dark after the Balrog. "Fly, you fools," he said, and fell. The chasm took them both.
They fell for a long time. The descent through Moria's depths is measured in terms that suggest distance so vast that the falling was not the brief cataclysmic plunge of a fall from a height, but something protracted, a falling that gave time for the things falling to continue to be themselves, to continue the contest between them even in the act of falling. What exactly passed between them in the air of that descent, no account records. What the account records is where they landed. An underground lake.
Cold water, far below the bridge, fed by underground streams that moved through the rock in ways the dwarves had never fully mapped. The Balrog's fire, encountering this, was quenched, not extinguished permanently, not destroyed, but driven back, reduced, the essential power still present, but the specific expression of it suppressed by contact with its opposite. Fire and water, at this depth, in this darkness, with this cold. They fought in the water. Gandalf's account of this period, given later in the form he described it, the form in which the experience was comprehensible, translated from what actually happened into something language could hold, says only that he fought the Balrog through the water and beyond the water, into the lower passages of Moria, through tunnels that the dwarves had never reached and never known, into the deep places beneath even the deepest the dwarves had gone. The Balrog fled. Through the dark it went, still powerful despite the quenching, still the fire recovering its full expression as they moved out of the water and into the dry tunnels below. It found the Endless Stair. The Endless Stair was real. Not a legend, not a figure of speech, but an actual construction within the mountain. A staircase that began at the lowest foundations of Khazad-dûm and rose through the rock all the way to the mountain's peak. It had been made in the days of Durin's greatest power, for reasons that were no longer entirely clear, and it had not been used in so long that most dwarves of later ages believed it to be only a story. The Balrog knew it was not a story. It had been in Moria's depths when the stair was built, or had come to Moria when the stair still had living users, and it knew the stair the way anything knows the territory it has occupied for the better part of 3 millennia. Up the stair it went.
Gandalf followed. The stair went up through the interior of the mountain. Not a comfortable ascent. Not anything that the body, even a Maiar's body in the form of an old man, could manage with ease. It was the Endless Stair because the ascent was effectively without limit in the sense that matters to legs and breath, and the will to continue placing one foot above the other in the dark. They climbed through the dark, and the Balrog climbed ahead of them, and what burned in the Balrog at this point was not only its fire, but its anger, the specific hot fury of a thing that had been quenched and was coming back to its full expression, and wanted the opportunity to express it on the thing responsible for the quenching.
They came out on the summit of Zirakzigil. The mountain's peak was open sky and cold wind, and in the early morning of the world above Moria, a light that the Balrog had not seen in any direct form for 3,000 years.
The snow on the peak was old and hard. The air at that altitude was thin enough that the wind moved through it with the specific cutting quality of wind that has no obstacle for a very long way in any direction. In these conditions, on the flat rock of the peak of Zirakzigil, the Battle of the Peak was fought. It lasted 3 days and nights.
The details of those 3 days are not fully preserved, and the gaps are meaningful. What happens when 2 Maiar of this nature engage in combat over 3 days and nights in the physical forms they wear is something that the physical world around the combat registers and records in its own way, and what the mountain registered was considerable. Rock cracked. The snow was burned away from areas of the peak that the fire touched. The temperatures involved in the sustained engagement of a Balrog at full expression, plus the energy released by a Maiar contesting it, are temperatures for which no scale in ordinary use exists. Gandalf threw it down.
The end came not as a single decisive blow, not as a clean narrative moment, but as the conclusion of exhaustion taken beyond every limit on both sides, until one of them reached the end of what it could sustain in that form. The Balrog fell from the peak of Zirakzigil. It broke the mountainside where it landed, the sheer physical weight of it, the density of 3,000 years of collected darkness and fire coming to rest against the rock below. And there it lay. And there, in that landing, it died.
The accounts use this word precisely, died. Not dispersed, the Balrog of Moria did not, at the end, retreat into the formless state that had preserved Durin's Bane through the War of Wrath. It died in the specific manner of something that has committed so completely to a physical form, has lived so long in that form, has fought so continuously within the constraints of that form, that the destruction of the form is the destruction of the thing itself. It had not been a spirit wearing a body. By the time Gandalf broke it on the peak, and it fell and came to rest below, the body and the spirit had become inseparable in a way that meant the end of one was the end of the other. The fire went out.
Gandalf did not survive it either. Not in the form he wore on the bridge, not the grey, the old, the deliberate limitation of the Maiar Olorin reduced to a staff and an old man's face. That form died in the 3 days on the mountain and was not available to be resumed. What the Valar sent back, what was returned to Middle-earth, because the work was not done, and the person most suited to the completion of it was the one who had just spent 3 days on a mountain, fighting something that had been accumulating its darkness since before the First Age, was renewed. Still Olorin, still fundamentally the same Maiar who had stood on the bridge and said, "You shall not pass," but returned with less constraint, less limitation, less of the deliberate reduction that had been the condition of his first sending. He came back as Gandalf the White. The exchange on the peak of Zirakzigil cost both sides everything they brought to it, which is perhaps the most precise statement about what the Balrogs ultimately were, beings capable of forcing the greatest single act of resistance the Third Age produced. The death of Durin's Bane, the last confirmed surviving Balrog, required the near death and the transformation of a Maiar
who had been sent specifically to aid the free peoples against the shadow, and it required the full expression of that Maiar's true nature over 3 unbroken days in conditions that would have destroyed any lesser thing entirely. This is what a Balrog cost.
This is what one of them cost alone, woken from 3,000 years of dormancy, worn by long centuries of silence, at the end of its long dark vigil, rather than at the height of its power. They killed 2 high kings of the Noldor. They destroyed cities. They broke the siege that was the free people's best chance of containing Morgoth before his power became unanswerable.
They did these things because they were what they had chosen to become, and what they had chosen to become was the most direct possible expression of destruction. Not the subtle, patient corruption of Sauron, not the political manipulation of the Nazgul, not anything requiring intelligence to be applied over time. Just fire and shadow, and the long practice of ending things.
They were Maiar, who had chosen fire as their weapon, and chosen a master who would point them at the things he wanted burned. That is the complete account of them. There is no interiority preserved in any record, no moment of doubt or conflict, no scene in which one of them hesitated before the destruction they were about to cause. Either no such moments existed, or, if they existed, they were so deep inside the shadow that no evidence of them reached the surface. They moved through the ages burning what was put before them to burn, and they died as fire dies, not with the complex endings of things that chose more complex paths, but simply quenched, or broken, or thrown down, and then out.
The fire in them was real. So was the fire they destroyed. The difference is in what each of those fires left behind. On the slopes of Zirakzigil, where the Balrog's body came to rest, the rock is still scored where it fell. The mountain keeps the record. Mountains are patient with this kind of record, and they do not forget.
Below, in the dark of Moria, the orcs that had served Durin's Bane scattered after its death, leaderless, purposeless, left with the cold halls and the deep dark, and nothing driving them anymore. Moria stood empty again, and stands empty still, and something in the quality of the silence there is different from the silence of other empty places, heavier, older, the silence of a space that has been occupied by something so dense and so dark for so long that even its absence leaves a shape. The bridge is still broken. No one has rebuilt it. Perhaps no one ever will.